fast forward, design in the future, the post-geographic city. So what does that mean? Post-geographic city, fast forward. I'm a little terrified about the future because I don't know necessarily how I fit into it. Do I have the aptitude to be a part of this future that seemingly smart people and maybe my kids and grandkids are going to be a part of? So luckily, we have two very smart guys that are here to help us figure out exactly what that is. Tim Durfee and Ben Hooker, they will lead you on a little presentation before we sit down and talk about it. Tim, Ben, take it away.
Forward to this conversation tonight and having the mic on. Ben Hooker and I are colleagues at ArtCenter College of Design, and we teach in the Media Design Practices program. But we're also practitioners of design. I'm primarily in the fields of architecture and related areas, and Ben is a media artist. And in our conversations at ArtCenter, we started to realize we had a shared interest in the city, the future of the city, and also in a sort of frustration with our respective fields in being limited and being relevant to what the city is now. Because if you think about a city, it's, the architecture is kind of the hardware, and media is really the software. Those things are now equal players in what make the kind of ecosystem of an urban environment. So we started to do some research on what they now call the smart city. And you've probably heard that term. But the more we looked into it, we realized it was, really smart people, engineers and policymakers conversing about how to make cities optimized and efficient. And after looking at image and conference after conference, we realized that there were no people involved in these conversations. We really realized that real lives were being left out of the conversation. And in many respects, we felt that that's what the role of design is, in some ways, is to advocate for an intermediary between the amazing things that engineers produce and actual people, and trying to negotiate those differences. So with all of those smart questions, we realized someone needed to ask the dumb questions. We felt very qualified to ask the big dumb questions. And so from there, we've actually formed a lot of our teaching and a lot of the independent work that we do together in our collaborations. So what about the city of the future? Why will people choose to live there, and what will they do all day? Is sort of the center of this whole thing, and kind of crafted this notion that we've now referred to as the post-geographic city, which I'll just sort of explain briefly, it's not so much something you can point to. It's just this notion that, if a city is also the communities, the connections we have with each other, and for so many of us, we're at least as engaged in our online communities as we are in our physical proximate communities. It only makes sense that in some respects, that's part of the city too. And so all of a sudden, the assumptions about what make a city, and therefore all of the design-related issues around it, need to be kind of contested and reconsidered.
And so I think something we found, we were looking at a lot of visions of the future in smart cities, is this big missing kind of cultural component. It's this kind of these visions of the future driven by sort of an engineering mindset, trying to answer, kind of make things more efficient, faster, optimized, all very reasonable kind of pursuits, but then kind of missing out sort of what it is, the more nuanced understanding of kind of the cultural dimension of the city. And so for the rest of the sort of our time now in this presentation, we're just going to rattle through some student projects, some of our own projects, really, really cursory, sort of dip into them with the aim to seed the conversation, I guess, afterwards.
Yeah, and it may be obvious, we'll just start off with them, but a lot of the attitude and the posture of the sort of work is to sort of perhaps provoke a little bit, sometimes to use humor as a way of raising issues that aren't otherwise addressed. In a sense, we think of it as our role, once again, to ask the questions that aren't being asked by engineers or policymakers, but that's really put ourselves in the middle, sometimes bringing things to perhaps an absurd conclusion. So projects like this, looking at the future of privacy.
I think as designers, you have this, you can kind of play the fool a bit, and you can kind of take something which is, and sort of push it to a bit of a ludicrous extreme to see kind of what breaks or what is interesting, what is revealed. So in projects where we're kind of imagining sort of where camera infrastructures are kind of part of buildings, or and sort of what sort of stories result from that.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways it shares what we're all familiar with Hollywood images of the future that, as we all probably have noticed, have great influence over the future, right? Engineers grow up watching these films and then developing those technologies. But in some respects, we use some of those devices as ways of teasing out potential futures, not always desirable futures, but things that we can sort of create as imagined worlds and sort of look around and see what we can learn from them. So one of the principal goals or tasks, we think, again, of a designer is to understand what people's values are, what they're hoping for, what their aspirations are. That's really what you're designing to. You're addressing the needs of people. And in this culture of solutionism and continued innovation, all of which is fantastic, but in many respects, it's actually innovating upon assumptions that haven't been updated. Our values have changed, our expectations have changed, our real lives have changed by this very technology, and yet oftentimes we're just updating based upon earlier assumptions. Some of these worlds are sort of playing out some of these absurd ideas.
So, I mean, just to mention, so what kind of thing you're seeing on screen at the moment, we imagine, there's if you have a certain number of YouTube followers, you get access to recording facilities at YouTube. So we're kind of taking that idea and kind of running with it to imagining that sort of the more followers you have in your social networks, that somehow translates literally into planning permission in the city. And so how does the city change shape when we kind of take that idea as a starting point?
Exactly. So why wouldn't it make sense that this little policy that affects a corporate relationship with something like space might be amplified to something at the scale of a city?
And so as you can see, we use kind of collage and installation a lot as a way of kind of sketching to kind of crash together sort of technologies and sort of experiences.
So we're going to wrap it up really soon, but once again, just some of these images. And we just want to say that, this is work we've now shared with engineers, with urban planners, with other professionals, and it's already become really useful as sparking these conversations, getting us to kind of go to those places when we imagine what the future is going to be like that we all share and that we're all influenced by.
And so in many ways, these projects, they act as a brief for a more applied project to follow. So we use these projects to seek out like projects where we're working with technologists or a particular community to do sort of a more applied work. But in this, what we're showing here is a collection of sort of trying to find new ways of thinking about what a city is in relation to technology.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, okay. So we need to unpack this a little bit and explain some of these things. One of the things I noticed right off the bat when I was seeing your presentation is something that said selfie building. Selfie building. What does selfie building mean?
Exactly what it says. No, I mean, this is a good example of something of taking a phenomenon we're all familiar with, any tourist-related destination you go to, people, of course, are capturing selfies, and it's become kind of a part of our culture, love it or hate it. We were sort of taking that phenomenon and just pushing it a bit into the future and imagining, perhaps an absurd conclusion of this sort of ever-increasing self-broadcast, and maybe there's a part of the population for which a place where your apartment is an ideal studio for that broadcast would be perfect. Once again, we don't particularly want to build that. We don't particularly want it. But actually, in a funny way, having it there has already sparked a lot of really interesting conversations. Why imagine people who literally have grown up in the culture of constantly recording every aspect of your life. In many ways, it changes the meaning of privacy. It changes our relationship to privacy. We already think that's happening.
Will we have privacy?
Yeah, exactly.
In this future, Los Angeles?
Who's to say? I think that it'll start to change. I would imagine, maybe there would be different relationships we have to it. Some people, would be the people that want to continue privacy, but other people, we've already discovered are willing to kind of hand it over and allow that to be something that's.
I mean, I think when we think about the city, thinking of it as not just a purely physical place. So the idea of the selfie building, if you think about, if you have like a home with a front yard, your front yard is kind of a display, right? It's like a semi-pub, people can see it. And so, thinking of your front yard, if it was like an electronic, like a media space, in a way, then you're thinking of the way we kind of exist, not just in the physical world, but we're existing in electronic media as well. So maybe kind of thinking of the selfie building as like the cameras become like your front yard.
So every aspect of our lives expected to be broadcast? Is that what we're talking about here, or just recorded, or how does that work?
Personally, I have no doubt that there will be people that have no problem with that. Mm-hmm. And I think we already see it happening. But once again, to sort of follow these things to a conclusion where we can start to question them, I think is really important. And otherwise, we think of these, every day there's some new app, new sort of great innovation that's out there. In many respects, we're not sort of taking that extra step of imagining how they all work together in the sort of ecology of a city.
I mean, the idea of being like constantly recorded in a sense, personally, I find that terrifying. But I think also but there is a case that we become kind of more sophisticated consumers of. You become more aware of different environments that are the kind of the places we inhabit, how our images are kind of generated and how they move into other spheres. And so I think by kind of, trying to kind of play that out through these kind of sketches and films, it kind of makes us think about that, which I think is important because it challenges a vision of the future where everything is kind of seamless, right? But actually maybe that's a bit boring.
How far off do you think this future is? 5, 10 years, 15?
Well, I mean, really the question I think would be, what future? In a way, not to say that we don't have a future, but I mean, rather, which future? I mean, there are so many different simultaneous trajectories that people are on. There are people that are sort of left out in a way of a lot of the advances of these technologies. And so in many respects, part of our tactic, if you will, is to sort of speculate on potential futures. So some of them we think of as plausible right now, in terms of existing technologies that are here, cultures that we can start to recognize as emerging, and recognizing that these are phenomena that can happen. I mean, one example of that now is, if you think about the effects of social media and the fact that people are establishing, really loyal communities online and amplifying their opinions among their own followers and people that are a part of their social networks. Well, already we can start to see how that's affecting the larger conversations. And for example, in this political climate, I personally have no doubt that a lot of the sort of amplification of emotion is connected to people's sort of living within these echo chambers of their shared opinions. And in some ways, that's a very post-geographic phenomenon. That is to say, these are communities that are built online, cultivated through that, but not necessarily through your neighbors next door that you're talking to. Yeah. And so that's a future that's really maybe we're living right now in a certain respect. That kind
So it is possible to mix these online and offline lives.
Well, I mean, I think we're striving to sort of think about that. It's just because I think we could kind of you could sort of have the opinion, well, actually, the physical city's not important anymore. We're going to retreat into these virtual worlds, and but I think we kind of believe in the city as the kind of an idea. It's a place where that's kind of the dumb question that we're asking, like, what is a city? It's kind of a place where you maybe encounter things that, it's like a place where culture is created. It's a place where you encounter people who are different than you, and it's kind of an intellectual space, and that kind of gets lost, I think, when technology is just kind of is kind of applied, and it just kind of flattens the kind of interactions we have with each other. So I think we don't quite know, we're kind of searching for kind of meaning in the built environment and how electronic social networks are part of that.
How do you think we'll be living with technology, like unmanned cars, drones? How will we be living, and how will we be planning our cities around those things?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, this is something that we all hear about in the news. We know it's just around the corner. We know that these are now technologies that are with us. But that question really is something we've been thinking a little bit about. You may be familiar that an acre, the measure of area is determined by the amount of distance that one person and a plow could plow over one working day. So there was a link between space and labor, which is really interesting.
How many of you guys have plows, by the way?
No? Mine's parked. It's self-driving plow. But
Good.
And so then we're actually looking, taking that simple idea and then combining it with self-driving cars and imagining how, for example, drones, which have a limited battery life, might start to become delivery drones. And we've heard about that, some of us, about that being something that's happening. Well, maybe a new kind of form of urban plan emerges where there's a place where they charge and then half the battery life is going out and half of it's back. Sounds very literal and not interesting, but if you multiply some of these simple observations about the character of this technology, you start to realize, yes, indeed, city shapes might start to change, and you might start to have new kinds of suburbs and new kinds of streets, clearly, when cars can optimize their parking. There's not, they can flock when they're on freeways to economize in drag.
So you're talking about designing communities where a drone will be able to reach everyone in that community. The unmanned car will be able to service everyone in that community.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many respects those kinds of approaches are inevitable. And I think part of our role is to sort of get in there, imagine it with all of the reckless sort of speculation that we can, but as a way of sort of raising the conversation before it's sort of upon us and we haven't really kind of processed it.
I think kind of looking for sort of missed opportunities, like if, this vision, the kind of engineering perpetuated, the self-driving car, you get in the car, you kind of say where you want to go and you don't think about it, it just takes you there. Well, that's kind of like riding an elevator, which is kind of really kind of not missing out the point. Like, it's not about just getting from A to B, I think is what we're saying. There's like the way we engage with the city, it's kind of like, it's like there's a pleasure, right? There's an aesthetic pleasure to it. And so that you would maybe choose, if you're in a self-driving vehicle, how do you set your preferences? It's not just about, it's not a choice of fastest or quickest. There's like a whole lot of other options. And so that's really interesting to think about as designers of interfaces, of spaces, of vehicles. And so we're kind of trying to find the new design questions that are outside a purely engineering optimization kind of mindset. Not that is not an important direction, of course, but we're just sort of like, but we want to, and this as well, we want to be thinking about.
When you're designing and thinking about this future and kind of planning exactly what it might mean, is what is already here part of that? Can it work in that future? Do we have to revamp the whole thing?
Well, clearly there are examples of urban futures that are wiping everything clean, and with the great master plan idea, and I think a lot of parts of the world, we saw that happen in the 50s, and it produced sometimes cities that weren't necessarily that livable. And people were, really pushing back against that idea of the big master plan of here, it's, I've got it all figured out. And so it's a good question because indeed, I think right now we're facing a time when there are cities being built from scratch. A lot of this discussions about smart cities are thinking of a city in a box. It's already planned, and you go and everything's figured out. And we've kind of been there before. We've been to a place where we've thought that a master planner can have it all solved in advance. And I think in many ways we want to kind of raise these questions and also introduce, as Ben mentioned, the role of culture. That is to say, what values do people have? Where does that fit within these cities? And how can we make sure that that's not left out of the equation?
How do you make sure that that's not left out?
That is a tough question.
Yeah.
I think what we have in terms of it's hit and miss kind of our approach, and we're certainly trying to speak with as many different kinds of whether it's engineers, whether it's kind of technologists, whether it's kind of trying to find a project where we kind of start to prototype stuff. So I don't know at all the answer. Just trying to share the work. Kind of, when you, as a designer, when you make something tangible, everyone has an opinion about it. So if you're talking, you can sort of as soon as you give something, as soon as you draw a picture, make an image, make a prototype, people have an emotional reaction to it, and they'll kind of say, "Well, I wouldn't. That terrifies me," or "Okay, that's kind of weird and cool." And so that's kind of where we. So I think that's what we enjoy in kind of this iterative process of discovering maybe ways that we live with these new technologies, which challenge kind of lazy visions of the future. And that's kind of, I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but I don't know is the short answer.
No, coming up in about 10, 15 minutes, we're going to take questions from the audience. So if you got questions, make sure you got them ready. Wondering when you guys are thinking about this in the future, how much do you factor in that most of us aren't at your level when it comes to thinking that far ahead?
Well, actually, it's funny. I think in many respects, I feel like part of our advantage as designers is that that we kind of are at your level. I think because in a way, I mean, we're experts in design, but not necessarily in engineering, as I mentioned. And that in many respects, in our studios and in the work that we do, a lot of it is built around collaboration. So we do work with people that are programs, we do work with engineers and scientists and so on. In a way, outsourcing the expertise to people that really know what they're talking about. In a way to preserve our perspective, which is to sort of, once again, kind of provoke and kind of keep keep the conversation alive about how people fit into these things. So I think that in terms of how everyone else can be included, I think it's interesting to consider how, aspects, for example, of the sharing economy. It sounds like we're in these sort of wonky terms, but we're all seeing it every day, right? We've heard about Airbnb and people sharing their houses and for people to stay, and ride sharing is now a pretty widely understood, or at least known about phenomenon. And so we're already starting to feel it, I think, in the general experience. And yet our cities look a lot the same as they used to, and yet they're really being used very differently. So I think that, it's not so much, I think in many respects, it's more about a lot of us kind of pushing back and not assuming that, oh, this is something I can't understand. People have got it all under control. I think it's actually more important for us to sort of push back a little bit and realize, hey, I'm being left out of this, or I don't like the way that Waze is making much more traffic in my neighborhood because it's sending it all. I live on a shortcut instead of this cul-de-sac I thought I lived on, or whatever. So those things are real, and they're weird sort of artifacts of this new logistical present that we're in.
When it comes to the sharing economy, all those things you mentioned, Uber and Airbnb, they've already changed a lot of how we live. But how can that go further when it comes to what you guys do in designing a future? Because I don't know how much more things can change, but obviously you two, that's what you think about all the time, is how much more things can change.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the projects we didn't get around to showing was like this idea of like the more and more things being like the Uberification of everything, right? So where you kind of imagine that everything is kind of just
Uberification.
Of just just kind of summoned just minutes before, just like seconds before you need it. And I think that that has interesting sort of architectural implications. How the way we inhabit spaces that are sort of just kind of literally rooms that are kind of just formed seconds before we open the door, which kind of sounds like maybe a sort of a cheesy sci-fi vision. But I think actually in a lot of these, just to sort of back up it, I think a lot of the motivation with this work is we're at this point where a lot of cheesy sci-fi visions are kind of attainable, and that's really scary, So we can kind of retreat into virtual environments. There's like the VR AR industry is kind of really hot at the moment, and we can cover everything with electronic screens. It's sort of, so these aren't visions of the future. They're there if we want them, and so then the question is, do we want them? And so that's an interesting point, because the kind of sci-fi cliches are kind of actually just around the corner. And so we're trying to sort of present more ways of thinking about this technology as part of the texture of everyday life in a way which isn't one kind of script fed to us by one technology company.
Do you think we want them? I mean, that's you guys talk about how you're in collaboration with people, so it's not you're at our level, but have you, in your experience, felt that we do want this?
Well, okay, so I'll answer that by saying that, right now you consider a lot of conversations about the future of work, and we know that conversation takes multiple directions. But one thing is unassailable, that indeed automation is here. I was just noticing a couple months ago, there was a person at parking attendant at a place where I park frequently, and then one day he was gone, and it was now all automated. Yeah. And that's happening at different scales all around the country, all around the world. And then so that's one thing, and that's frightening, and it's replacing jobs, and it's a result of a solutionist, engineering-driven thing. Nothing against engineers, but without the sort of complexity of how perhaps you could think of automation as something that is in collaboration with humans as opposed to straight up replacing them. Another example that's related is the phenomenon of the sharing economy when it comes to work. So the so-called gig economy, we've heard about the fact that, many of us will have many jobs over the course of our life. In many cases, people will never have one big job, but lots of gigs you just kind of go to. And you think about that in combination with something like Uber, right? So you have your phone that's saying, okay, I've now got to report to job number 2 of today, and you go there. And it's actually not so unbelievable that could happen. And then that kind of optimization is actually a way of addressing work shortages in other ways, or the fact that people aren't having enough employment. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's not so much that people want it, it's sort of that, one thing happens because of one technology, another one comes in to solve the problem that it created, and then another one comes in to solve that. And it requires sometimes people to speak up about how it all fits together. And it actually, one just quick thing, Ben mentioned culture, and in many respects, we think of culture as, high art or stories that we tell, and that's a dimension of culture. But in many respects, culture are the values we share as a people, and they're the stories that seem relevant to each other, and they are reflected in other things that we produce. In many respects, that's why we're noticing that culture hasn't caught up. We're not acknowledging that these technologies have changed those values, and if that's present, maybe we can anticipate how those technologies might have a bad effect or a good effect.
With this post-geographic Los Angeles, wondering how it fits in places that maybe don't have a ton of money. That all this stuff sounds and looks great, but it looks like it's expensive, and it looks like it's for people that can afford it. So how do you, when you're designing this, how do you try and factor that part in? Can this work in South Los Angeles, in East Los Angeles?
Yeah. Well, I would say that that's really important, and right now there's this kind of linkage between the notion of technology as a product in some respect, or something that is can be put into the world as a commercial venture. But then, so you have this big divide, and then you have conversations like the ones we mentioned about the smart city, about optimizing the city and how policy might evolve. And I think that's where there's a real opportunity to start to allow people who are interested in the lives of real people, everybody involved in cities, but everywhere, to have a place at those tables, Because frankly, once again, these conversations about the smart city, at least from our experience, typically, aren't everybody necessarily. They're advocating certain interests, and it's not all nefarious by any means, but it's it's not necessarily completely inclusive. In some respects, I think it's really important for us to know what these are about and sort of anticipate what potential futures might come out of this.
And how do you make sure that this is something that everyone gets in on, or maybe it's not necessarily that it's not big giant corporations that are handing you this future? How do you make sure that everyone has a chance at this?
Yeah.
Well, with these projects, I think we would just come out and say these are sort of broad brush stroke like sketches, and so one of the things we're actively trying to do is kind of find ways that we can set up kind of more tangible kind of projects with collaborators that are based on some of these ideas. So I don't want people to think that this is sort of that we're presenting stuff which is kind of buildable, that these are just kind of like that they're meant to be kind of like first stages of setting up kind of new, more applied projects. And I don't know what those projects are yet, but it's something that we, like, as designers, we kind of certainly seek out these opportunities to move from like projects where we're just kind of thinking about concepts to actually projects where we're actually building stuff with real constraints, with real people. And so that's kind of that's sort of what we're looking for, really. And I don't know what the specific project is we're doing next, but we're certainly not trying to shy away from finding an opportunity to do work.
But also say, just to answer, also what you're getting to is that there are indeed people for whom these conversations aren't a part, and in many respects, people we need to be more proactive about getting everyone involved in these kinds of conversations about the future in general, but also the future of our cities in particular, and that there are forms of outreach that exist. I think that typically they might operate in certain bandwidths that are repeated over and over again. I think it's not necessarily a holistic inclusion, and I think that's really something that needs to happen.
As designers, where do you see your roles going forward in this post-geographic future?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think that, as I mentioned, we both have our own work. We do different kinds of projects, and the different scales, different contexts, and a lot of it doesn't necessarily involve media per se in this sort of technological sense of it, and that's part of what we're getting at. I think that my particular interest personally is in the realm of things related to architecture, is finding new forms of relevance, new ways of making things that are actually connected to the values that we have now. And I know that sounds obvious perhaps, but I personally see it over and over again, the idea of taking, of designing things, developing things for us that once again are based on assumptions of how we used to live and things that used to be important or things that were less urgent and that are now very urgent. And I have to say that, I don't necessarily think that, buildings with technology embedded everywhere is going to be the answer. It's actually more subtle than that. It's like, how have these phenomena that we live with every day been kind of internalized into our culture as a part of who we are, and how can that then change how we make our world? And so I think that's a difference that is really important to me as a designer. Once again, work relevant today doesn't mean what we used to have plus technology. It's actually not what we used to have. We should be revisiting, what we take for granted in our surroundings and consider what is necessary now. Who are the underserved now? What are we not experiencing that we used to experience that we need more of? What are values that matter to us now that didn't matter to us before? And how can that change assumptions about the buildings we inhabit, the cities we live in, the objects and products that we use? And so it's more of a subtle thing. And once again, I think that there's a habit in this culture, this sort of solutionist culture of saying, oh, well, here's an issue, let's just throw technology at it, And so I guess what I'm trying to get to personally is like a place that's a kind of a next generation of how these transformations are now part of us, and how do we live in a new way.
I mean, I think a practical thing that we're also doing next is, we teach graduate students, and that's like a really good excuse to kind of experiment on them with these ideas. And so we're running a project thinking of using this kind of work as a starting point for thinking about how these ideas about technology map onto Los Angeles as and it's a 4-week intense project that we're starting in 2 weeks' time. So that'll be interesting to play out, because our students are all from very different backgrounds, and so thinking about how kind of these various kind of technological innovations could change the lives of certain people within the city, and kind of finding a way to sort of communicate that and think about that. So in a way, this sort of work becomes the brief for this experimental project we're doing with the students, and that's something that we're really excited about as well.
I think if you have a question, I think we're going to have a microphone running around there. So right here in the front.
My name is Don. I live about a mile or two away. I'm sort of curious what you think an engineer is. I'm a systems engineer, and I think that you're doing a certain amount of system engineering right now. I mean, typically, the problem is in communicating what's needed. You're going to construct a value function, which has got to do with your budget, your time scale, and so forth. With a typical system engineer is going to be willing to tell you all the things you could do in addition for just a little more money. And that's the kind of negotiation that goes on. You must be talking about some other type of engineer. You're probably already doing this to some extent all on your own.
No, it's interesting, and it's true. Like, I come from a family of engineers, and I also know that there are many.
What happened? Why did you become a designer?
It went the other way, or not the other way. I don't know. I went some other way. But I have to say that it's a term. It's true. It's a term that applies to many different paths and disciplines and so on. And it's true. We're using it in this sort of casual way. But I think part of from my experience in architecture, for example, I really feel that there's a kind of position in how things come about where engineers kind of advocate for a certain perspective, the architect advocates for another perspective, the client advocates for another perspective, and their duking it out arrives at hopefully a good result. And so it's not necessarily to say that, oh, this represents only one way of thinking and this is another way of thinking, but it does have to do with a kind of a dialogue, And I think that many people would would recognize that in places like Silicon Valley, where incredible corporations have been built largely around, profoundly amazing innovations in engineering, cultures that are producing new ideas and putting these things out, sometimes without fast forwarding and imagining how it's going to exist in our world. And so that is an error that could happen in any other discipline. And so it's not so much, not engineering or anything like that. It's a little bit more about an uncontested orientation to production. Does that make sense? In other words, like if only one field generates the things that have such huge influence on our lives, then without anyone pushing back, then it's only going to represent the sort of values that come with that discipline. And I also have to say, I take full ownership of the fact that we're representing values and opinions up here, and God help us if no one's pushing back on the things that we're putting out there. And I think that's really important. And I think, but when we say things like solutionist culture, I think in many respects, it's sort of an indictment of the time we're in, right? Where everyone's in awe of the incredible new technology that's coming out of some fantastic corporations, but they're not necessarily someone speaking up for how they fit into our actual lives. And so it's not so much an indictment or anything about engineers per se, but rather an uncontested culture that has sort of emerged, I think.
Anybody else got a question right here in the front as well? And real quick, so this pushback that you're talking about too, how often do you get that from people when you present this? Is there a pushback of fear, or is it a pushback of not understanding? Where do you think it comes from?
Yeah, often when we present it, I mean, the sort of, well, I could give you a list. I mean, it's just sort of, I've had people say, this work must be stopped, I mean, Maybe
they're scared, you think?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and this idea that, and I think that, and I think this idea that, it comes back to that as a maker, as soon as you prototype something, as soon as you sketch something, this for designers, this is just kind of what we do. It's kind of an iterative process. But then people, you have an opinion about it. It sort of becomes real, even though maybe for a design we don't think of it as real. We just think of it as part of like an iteration. Like we're just kind of the act of drawing. For us, I think for any kind of like a sort of creative practitioner is an act of discovery. You kind of make something and then you stand back and you kind of look at it. Yeah, and I think so. So what we're doing here, and and frankly, kind of a little bit kind of conscious of showing stuff which is kind of in progress. It's just like, okay, we're toying with these ideas.
So you haven't even come up with a final vision sometimes.
Of course, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And even, I mean, the things we're showing, that humor is kind of important because it's important that people know we're serious in the trajectory we're taking. Mm-hmm. We're serious in the questions we're asking. We're not serious in literally implementing this thing you see. We're interested in sort of the conversation en route to something further down the line.
Question right here.
All right, at the risk of being somewhat solutionist, I feel like we're talking in very general terms about a lot of this, and I'm really interested in hearing like one potential future that you've sort of played out, and using this idea of the new technologies and how it affects our cities and the space we inhabit. I'd like to hear just one that you've actually worked through and kind of where you think that's going. Just like a specific. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Solution. She wants a solution. Go ahead, Ben, Tim.
I can talk from my history. Okay, with this, what we've just shown, this is kind of just the start. So from my history, so I worked many years ago with cell phone companies, designing with Philips, who used to make phone handsets, and with a company based in Helsinki who made the transmitters in the phone network. And we came up with, as a team based at an art college in London, where I used to be faculty, we did a whole project imagining this idea of looking at various kind of location-based services, right, that you could have with your cell phone. So the idea that where you are in the city, you're getting different piece of information on your cell phone. And we came up with a whole kind of set of animations, of films, and a booklet that then the engineers who made the handsets, what we were doing with our kind of visions of how people would kind of play using cell phones in the city, the things we were coming up with influenced the firmware they were designing on the microchips in those phones. So it was kind of, for me, just to kind of to see that, although the firmware is this very, very kind of low level, right? Low level, the software that runs on the chips in the phone. That we're working with the phone company. Our brief was to kind of think of maybe the sort of somewhat irrational things people find entertaining to do using their cell phones. And it's interesting now, this idea of like the fusion of like the information space, like of the internet, and the urban space of the city is fused together. Pokemon Go is like very, very.
I'm glad you said that, because that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and don't claim any like authorship for that at all. But I'm saying that was an example for me as a designer, working with engineers, and who are designing very like physical, tangible products. So that was an example. I worked with. I was a visiting faculty at Intel Research as well, as a kind of designer in residence at their labs. And I can't point to a product that they have did, but we did a whole publication about how thinking about domestic technologies, how you think about technology for the home is you have a completely different rationale than technology for the workplace, which seems really obvious, right? That's kind of the most of course, but thinking about like what the home is as sort of a restorative environment versus an office as maybe has a different kind of space. And so it was basically in that project, it was thinking of a kind of a conceptual framework and guidelines for technologists to think about technology in the home versus technology in the workplace. So I can't point to a product, but I can point to it was a paper at an engineering conference that I collaborated with scientists. So it doesn't always land in that way, but there are kind of cases where you're doing this kind of frankly a bit kind of bonkers kind of stuff, but then you can kind of draw you can see how it influences.
I'll give one example in terms of the built city, and this wasn't built, but this is a tangible idea. I was involved in a charrette for imagining the future of the LA River, and we're all sort of probably aware of some of that conversation. And going back and forth about thinking about how would this work, and how could it evolve? How do we think of such a huge piece of infrastructure as something that can be kind of understood in the imagination of people in LA? And based upon a lot of the work that we've done and sort of conversations that we've had, I was actually bringing up the fact that yes, the LA River is 35 miles, or whatever it is. I don't know the exact dimension, but it's vast. It's huge, and sort of even think of developing it all as one kind of entity is almost unimaginable. For example, we think of the High Line, in downtown Manhattan as a very successful urban way of turning a park from an existing piece of infrastructure, but it's minuscule in comparison. The High Line is puny if you compare it to the LA River. But then I was sort of saying, well, if you think about how many people will start to see LA through Google Street View, satellite view, that's a way we navigate the city now. And if you started to create it as a long green band, a park that has a super scale, it changes your perception. It changes how that could be understood as a piece of infrastructure, as an asset to the city, as something that's really unique. You could see it from space, and that sounds fantastic, but it's real. We're doing that every single day, many of us, and so that just little flip in mindset is something that you'll find in many of these conversations about the future of the LA River, future of other things, and people aren't sticking up for the fact that there are things that we're doing every day that are right in front of us that we don't think as counting. Somehow it's thought of as ephemeral and not important. But the fact is, it really could influence how we sort of conceive of something like that, All
right, another question right in the middle there.
Thank you. Could you give us some specific predictions of things that are going to change in Los Angeles as it becomes a post-geographic city? The billing for this event talked about envisioning the future of LA. So I'd like some what buildings are going to change? What's going to go there? Is there going to be a High Line here? I mean, but in a post-geographic way. I mean, a High Line is just, that's already in New York. That doesn't seem post-geographic.
I can't. I'm just going to say that.
We didn't write the billing, but no. How will LA change? Actually, in many ways, I would say that LA of any city in the world is something that I think we're sort of starting to experience as something that's embracing its kind of simultaneous online thing that people telecommuting across town, sort of Skyping across town. This happens everywhere. This is not a sort of an eyebrow raising observation I'm making, but I think that I think we'll start to see different settlement patterns. We've witnessed the expansion of the city when people were sort of moving, migrating to a part where it was maybe less expensive, or inviting suburbs and then commuting into the city. And now we've encountered that commuting is too difficult, and it's sort of all of these shifts are ongoing. And I'm certainly not going to pretend that I'm an urbanist expert about Los Angeles in particular. But I have to say that I would sort of answer your question, which is an excellent question. But kind of going back to what I was suggesting before about something like the LA River, I would say that for all of us who are familiar with how we occupy Los Angeles and how we live in it, and how technology, for example, is such a big part of that experience, I would actually not leave that off our imagination of what LA would be. Do you know what I mean? In other words, we think of the physical city, we think of what the skyline is going to look like, right? We think of those as what a city is, right? But it's a lot more than that. It's actually, it is the patterns of Waze traffic, right? It is the ways in which we communicate with people through our smart devices. And eventually there's going to be a point when that starts to register in a physical way on our cities. And I guess the one thing I want to add here is that even just invoking things like, technology, apps, and so on, it sounds so corny, It sounds kind of so geeky and so obsessed with the tech. And that's really not where we're coming from. We're just trying to say, hey, everybody, that's really what we're doing, a lot of the day. And why shouldn't that be considered a part of our imagination of what the city is? So, I would also like to know what LA will look like in 5 years. And it's booming. It's taking off as a city. And that's super exciting. But I just sort of hope that we're paying attention and we can sort of speak up for things that matter to us in that change. So it's a deflection in this period of deflection. This is that's the season for that. Anyway, okay. And I don't know what that was about, but anyway, but yeah, So but it's a good question. It's right on for sure.
We have one right there. Yeah. We'll get to you in next.
Yes, I wanted to say, as far as the infrastructure for all the things you're talking about, newfangled things that you're talking, how safe would it be as far as the electromagnetic waves used to control all of these new autonomous vehicles, drones or whatever? Would it be safe for people? I know that generally when you have people that live under power lines in certain areas, there's a high incidence of cancer in areas. Has that been taken into consideration, and maybe the EPA will have some input on what you're, proposed or so?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait. So when you're designing this future Los Angeles or imagining it, how will it affect people's health? I mean, it's something so basic, but yeah.
I would just say that's a perfect brief of the kind of thing we would assign in a class. Exactly that, which is to say, here's this thing, everyone's talking about it. What about the health implications? I think it's a really great question. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, and I think as designers, we're kind of looking for constraints that kind of give the projects more shape. And so what we're doing with the project that we're launching in a few weeks' time is it's like, how do you take something like that observation and kind of build on some of these ideas and start to, okay, what will be taking this idea of this link between electromagnetic radiation and health, and start to imagine sort of an architecture that takes that into account.
Is it too early to know? Do we not have enough information to say one way or the other?
It's a good question, and I have to say that I think there are, and I don't want to make this sound like a paranoid comment, but there are people for whom it's not in their interest to go there and sort of sit on that question. And in many respects, you know, it's important to raise those questions. It's important to ask about that. We don't know the effects of this, and I think, you know, being a little bit informed and starting to imagine, you know, yes, indeed, how do these new technologies around us change something like that, affect our health, it's more of a question. And then once again, like in our process that we're always advocating, then you connect with an expert and get them on it. You know, hey, I've thought about this. Chances are those experts in question may not have focused on this particular issue. And oftentimes it's accelerating so quickly that I think it's important for us as citizens, you know, to put those kinds of two and two together questions together and think about how to raise these issues.
We had a question right over here. Let's see.
Hi, I'm Jimmy, and I'm kind of curious if you think physical and tangible design will still be relevant in the future given the way technology is progressing. Like Ben was saying, if they're commuting to work or whatever, it's not about just time getting there. You might want to see how everything looks, but if everyone's on their cell phones all day and the car's going to drive automatically and everything's going to be VR or augmented reality, you might just have the same old buildings and it might be overlaid with different skins. Service providers might be competing with overlays to give you different views of the world, and you're probably even wanting to sleep, catching up on your sleep. So what's it gonna matter? And people might even have different skins when you look at them, and I don't even have to buy clothes anymore, don't need designer clothes. They'll give me a full head of hair. I just pay a service provider to put into your eyeglasses what I want you to look, want you to see me like that day, or even when you go home. You know, your walls and your cube, it's all gonna be this reflective screens, and you could be in different experiences every day. It look bigger than your smaller cube that you're existing in. You go to the bathroom, you come back, and your table's like all expanded from a table into a desk, and your chair's like transformed and pushed itself against a wall and camouflaged itself. And so, I mean, that's all digital design. So what's physical, tangible design gonna be like?
That's awesome. I love that. I love every part of it. No, honestly, I'd say there's a lot of tangible design in what you described, you know? I mean, and it's existing in real space, and, you know, the chair that you talked about going up. I mean, no, but it's a good question, and I think that, but the part that I just want to say, and Ben, you can say, it's just, we're still us, you know, and people will want real things. And somehow it's left out of the equation a lot of times, where it's like, oh, we'll just accelerate into this virtual future. And it's absolutely possible. There's no question about it. In fact, a lot of the things you described we can do now, as you know. But yeah, I think that's where it becomes this little more difficult cultural question. What do we want, you know? And then if we can start to imagine what we would want, or imagine what we don't want, those are all relevant. And if we just sit and idly allow these things to just keep coming out, once again, it's not about saying they're not going to come out, but it's about investing ourselves in our own future, you know? But I loved your stream of
You're still buying pants in the future. That much I can pretty much guarantee. Any other questions? Right there, right over there. We'll get to you next.
I had a question thinking about robotic cars, which I think are going to come to fruition in the next 5 or 10 years. And in LA, with our lack of public transport, and if you take the human out of driving a car, it's going to be a lot cheaper to get around. And I could see a place where they'd be collectors going around neighborhoods and delivering to people to the subway. And it would be a lot cheaper than owning a car at some point. And then the other point that I wanted to ask about is, have you thought about the displaced workers? You know, like the first thing's going to happen is all the truck drivers, there won't be any more truck driving jobs, and then cabs, and then other technologies. Like, have you explored that? Like, what do people do when there's no work for them to do, unless they're very highly skilled or they're very highly educated?
Yeah.
I remember you mentioning the attendant that isn't at the parking structure. In West Hollywood, there is an automated parking structure where they don't need any people to work this parking structure. So yeah, so what about this future? Does it include people that maybe won't be employed anymore as much?
Yeah. Well, indeed, actually, the subject of work is the theme, the sub-theme of this studio that we're just starting up, and to really raise that question. And I think it's interesting. That's an example of an issue where, once again, the answer to that sort of technologically brought about problem might not be technology, might not be more technology. It might have to do with reformatting our relationship to the idea of work. It might be that people are doing different things during their day. I mean, this sounds all very dark and everything, but if you put yourself, there are places where they're making a 30-hour work week and ways of revisiting assumptions we have about work. And
that's not really where we're going. We're going more of a class of society where the broad benefits that everyone could share are not really being shared. So unless we imagine a much different society in the future, that doesn't seem like we're going to that 30-hour work week.
Exactly, and maybe we do have to imagine a much different society in the future. I mean, I think that's sounds dramatic, but I think that in many respects, once again, this kind of retooling of assumptions that aren't necessarily sustainable maybe is something worth talking about. Whether we want it or not is another issue, but I think that, once again, the question of work is really profound, and it's really enmeshed with our expectations, our hopes, our assumptions, our culture, our politics, and once again, it's a question where it may have been largely, at least in the case of automation, will have been brought about because of technology, but once again, it may not be a technological answer that helps us address that.
We'll get to your question. One second. When you earlier brought up values and using all of this to kind of mix with our values and what we feel is important. You think our values will change, though, when this city takes its new shape? How do you think we will change?
That's something that's very exciting. This idea that technology changes us, right, and kind of makes us the impact of the transformation of like our psychology by technology. Maybe we want things that we didn't know we wanted, or it kind of, and that's interesting to think about as well. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that real space, like physical, actual space, might be valued and prized in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, we really don't know, and these things are subtle. I mean, I think we can all think of examples historically where we might not have anticipated the way in which people ultimately end up changing their values and the ways in which they end up building their cities. It's not necessarily a straight line, There are many examples in the history of media, for example, where one thing was put out with one idea and usage in mind, and people had a totally different thing in mind, and I could go into many examples of that sort of thing. And I think that we'll start to see that with a lot of the technologies we now take for granted in one use, and we realize people actually find a more interesting way to take advantage of it. And so I think that a lot of that has to do with the evolution of our values, as we said. I mean, it sounds like a very lofty word, but I think that's actually really what's at stake.
Right here, right in the front.
Hello. I have a two-part question. So my first question is, what do you see as the future for civic participation and with technology? And the second part is, do you believe there's going to be a different role, or what role do you see in bridging various stakeholders in a city, whether it's public policy or whether it's designers, architects? Is there a specific role, or is that coming from a specific industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of engagement in people's own civic future is a really, really good question for multiple reasons, though. One reason is that, potentially technology and social media and so on, things that we sort of include in the blanket term of technology, I suppose, has a great opportunity to make our democracy work in a more open way, right? So that people could be more directly engaged. And I think we've seen that, certainly to some degree. But as I mentioned earlier, we've also experienced, in some cases, an unpleasant amplification of opinions of people, feeling that their ideas are uncontested by the echo chamber of their own, followers, and just having their own opinions reinforced. And I think some people are starting to think maybe that's a little damaging to our democracy. Maybe we have something to be concerned about. So I'm not answering your question directly. I'm sort of suggesting that the question about the future of our civic life in relation to technology is not an easy answer. And I think right now, we're experiencing both the pluses and the minuses of that, I think simultaneously in a weird way. So I would sort of answer to say, yes, we need to think about that. We need to be talking about it. We need to be coming up with suggestions of ways in which we can address it, because it's just, if people's opinions are so siloed the way that they are, it seems now, just imagine 5 years from now, it's just going to get more the case. And so that's where we need to start to think about it, our relationship to that in a different way. So it's excellent. Those are spot on. I'm trying to remember the second question though.
The second question is, do you imagine a specific role bridging the various industries, whether it's public policy, city government, design, architecture, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, once again, I think that, various forms of media can serve as a kind of a catalyst and a common ground for sharing ideas and allowing these things to be more sourced across disciplines and so on. I'm generally speaking about how this might go. Who's to know? I think that there have been certain developments that are more publicly understood that may not have been that way before the sort of great lateral sharing that social media enables. But I think I agree. I think there's actually a lot of room for proposing new ways that those kinds of bridges can be built. Because I think you're right. I think there is a lot of it's always a worry when one group's interests aren't contested, and I think that that's the great virtue of democracy, is allowing these conversations to be open and allow things to get to a place where they serve people the best way they can. And so I'm not answering it because I know the answer, because I don't, but I am agreeing that I think it's something that's urgent to figure out.
We got time for a couple of more questions right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Andy. Question is really about geography. And certainly in LA, the conundrum has been our distributed geography. And you can think about not having to drive to work, right? You telecommuting, drones delivering, and kind of removing the need to kind of interact with other parts of society. And so I'm going back to your question, Tim, about this kind of balkanization and parochialism. When we have a world where we can define our own sphere because of technology, are we at risk of kind of losing that connection of the diversity that maybe is the core of Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think we are at risk of that personally. I mean, I'm not hugely alarmist about it because I somehow feel that we'll figure it out. But I think it's a really interesting question. Like, one thing that has occurred to me is, historically thinking about the city-state, at many hundreds of years ago, where there was an impulse to kind of create an isolated, independent, government essentially that's kind of much smaller in scale, in this case specifically defined by geography. But what is weirdly similar to what I think is starting to occur to people is that, if your balkanized, online realm is one that crosses borders, and you're more engaged with that than you are in your own politics, right? Voting on an emergent community than you are actually voting for things that affect your physical world. It's not hard to imagine a sort of strange emergence of a kind of different form of global politics. Once again, sounds very dramatic, but it doesn't seem so far-fetched, really, And so as far as how it affects something like Los Angeles, I have no idea. But I think it's a provocative question. I think it's something that we should include in the conversations when we think about the future of our city and any city, is to sort of allow, in many cases, these are separate conversations. That's really what I'm talking about. People talk about the growth of cities, and people talk about the effects of social media, and sometimes they don't include them in the same conversation. And why not? Because they are very similar conversations. And then the closer you look, you realize how close they are to issues of work or issues of politics and but also issues of technology and all of these fabulous things that are happening. And I guess that's partly what we're doing, is that this stuff seems absurd in many cases, but every single time, really rich conversations come out of it. And that wouldn't have happened if you showed something that was maybe too familiar, right? And by kind of going there and sort of going to the weird place and having, you know, a space that's maybe a little absurd, maybe a little ridiculous, but we found it's been really productive in kind of fueling those conversations. So we mentioned earlier, you know, how have people reacted? We've definitely had people push back, but we've actually had surprising alliances emerge, if you will, from people within different disciplines that realize, you know, we need to have these kinds of conversations.
I mean, this idea of, like, you know, our kind of dumb question, like, what is a city, is sort of your question about, you know, when what I think inspired some of this research is these projects is that for us it is a place which has this kind of particular kind of serendipitous quality where you do counter ideas which challenge your own just by virtue of sharing a space with people who are different than you, and with customization, you know, with kind of sensing and control and customizations of, like, the physical environment as well as the virtual the idea that you could sort of conceivably go about your day not physically, emotionally connecting with anyone who kind of challenges, you know, even in the most gentle way, challenges your worldview is something that we see kind of it's kind of hidden in these visions of the smart city that we're looking at, where technology is kind of embedded in everything, and everything is controlled, and it's sort of this idea of like a seamless efficiency that allows you to do the things you want to do, but then it becomes terrifyingly not a city.
Just one comment on that is, it's certainly appropriate to where we are at KPCC, is the difference between kind of news that knows what you like to read and it feeds it to you versus a format like public radio or a traditional media where editors are kind of opening your eyes to ideas that maybe are ones that you wouldn't choose yourself.
Got time for one more question in the back, right there.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. This is all really interesting. But I guess maybe as a final question, I'm struggling with the idea of what you mean by post-geographic city. I mean, geography is going to be inherent in all of these things, no matter if drones or Waze are changing the ways that, you know, we move about the city. To me, it's suggesting more of a new geography than a post-geography. So if you could maybe just define what you mean by post-geography.
Yeah, I think it's good, and I think that in many respects our relationship to that term has evolved. But I will say that there is a dimension of it that is not necessarily geographical. I think your point is really right on, of course, which is that it's something you can't escape entirely. But there's a dimension of the kind of shapelessness of online communities that, you know, eludes. You know, it's not conventionally geographic. You know, and you're right. It might be a spider web of geography in some respect, but it's really sort of saying that, you know, kind of a period after which geography is the prevailing characterizer, you know, prevailing quality that defines a city, and that it's sort of more generically used as a post. The post suffix or prefix is what's sort of capturing the spirit more, which is to say, you know, a time when we need to sort of expand what we think of as a city and what's at stake when we define the physical shape of a city, to also include those sort of you know, scaleless tentacles that stretch out over its connective elements. But there's no question. I mean, it's a sort of in some ways a clumsy term that has, you know, awkward specificity to it, and over time I think we've gotten kind of comfortable with it because of that quality, that it's not really pretending that oh, welcome to this new thing, but rather like, well, hadn't thought of that in that way, and maybe other perspectives can come from it. But you know, I totally get what you're saying.
So does this growth of this new city, this smart city, will it exist in the space we have? Will it require new space?
Well, one thing I'll say is that we're, in a way, distancing ourselves from what has been called the smart city, in as much as, you know, the smart city emphasizes that kind of value of optimization. You know, the idea that everything is smart and perfected and solved, and that in response to that, we're sort of saying those technologies are great, But what we imagine in this kind of evolution of the city is that it's going to sort of be as rich and as varied as the cities that we've always treasured, and that's part of the future city. And one of the qualities of that future city is that it's not just geographically defined, but it's also something that includes these other more abstract ways in which we experience cityness, you know? And so it is awkward and abstract, but that's what we do.
As long as my Thomas guy still works, that's all I want.
Tim Durfee, Ben Hooker, thank you very much for giving us this look ahead at LA in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you
Tim
very
and
much.
Ben, everyone.
And thanks for coming out, and be sure to listen to Take Two tomorrow at 9 o'clock.